The Green River country in spring was a land newly awake, wet grass shining like coins, cottonwoods whispering under the thaw, and the smell of wood smoke drifting far across the flats. By late May, the valley below Horse Creek was no wilderness at all, but a rough-built city of skin tents, wagon camps, and trading stalls. The annual rendezvous had drawn them all again. Trappers, traders, and free trappers' wives, wrapped in bright cloth, shouting prices in French, Crow, Blackfoot, and English. The air was alive with barter and boasting. Rifles cracked for sport, a barrel of Taos whiskey was rolled open beside the smith's tent and drunk by the dipper. Somewhere, a fiddle was sawing out a reel learned from the Canadians. Yet beneath the laughter and gunfire lay the same restlessness that haunted every mountain man who had wintered too long without pay. Furs fetched less each year, the beaver were harder to find, and even the whiskey seemed watered by disappointment. That was when the talk began talk of a map. The story spread faster than fire through dry sage. Some said it came from a dying priest in Taos. Others that it was found under the floorboards of an abandoned mission, drawn in Spanish ink on parchment so old the edges flaked away like ash. It showed, they claimed, a hidden chain of silver workings in the high San Juan Mountains, mines the friars had worked a lifetime ago, before Indians or blizzards or Spanish law had swallowed them up. And the man said to possess that map was a newcomer to most of them. Elias Boone Hardesty, a blacksmith by trade, a trapper by necessity, and a mystery by choice. Hardesty kept to himself at the rendezvous. He had set his forge a little apart from the trading stalls, near the bend where the creek shallowed over stones. All day the ringing of his hammer carried through camp, bright, regular, and patient. The man was tall but lean, his face burned to leather by years on the trail, hair the color of iron filings, and eyes so pale they looked almost gray. His forearms were cross-hatched with old burns and scars, proof of years spent over the anvil. When he worked, he moved with the calm of someone who trusted steel more than men. It was said he had once shod horses for the Bent brothers on the Arkansas, then vanished for 2 winters, living among the Ute. Others whispered he'd been south into New Mexico, maybe even to the old Spanish missions where silver crosses were still found buried under clay floors. No one could say for certain. He didn't talk about himself, and when asked, only smiled in that quiet way that made a man more curious than before. But curiosity in the mountains was a dangerous thing. Rafe Stoddard, a Missouri trapper known for his temper as much as his speed with a flintlock, took special interest in Hardesty's secret. Stoddard was everything Hardesty wasn't: loud, handsome in a rough way, and as changeable as a creek in flood. He had led parties through the Wind River, ranged and bragged of killing more grizzlies than he could count. His word carried weight among the younger men, and when he declared that Hardesty's Spanish treasure was nothing but a tale for whiskey nights, the laughter that followed was sharp enough to cut hide. "Map, hell," Stoddard said one evening by the fire, kicking at the coals. "More likely he's drawn himself a route to the next free meal." A few of the men laughed. Others looked away. No one liked to provoke Hardesty openly, for there was something steady about him that made mockery feel childish. Still, the rumor persisted, fueled by half-drunk boasts and the long, idle hours before trade began in earnest. Charles Larpenteur, who kept the American Fur Company's books that year, would later write of that rendezvous. There was among the trappers a fever of discovery, a restlessness not common even to that wild class of men. Talk of Spanish mines went round the fires like a contagion, and every map, drawn in dirt or on bark, seemed to point toward the same phantom mountains. On the 3rd evening, the fever broke into confrontation. Hardesty was at his forge, hammering a gunlock spring for one of the Ashley men, when Stoddard strode up with 3 companions at his back. The sky behind them was bruised purple, the air thick with smoke and the smell of roasting meat. "Evenin', Smith," Stoddard called, using the title as a taunt. "Word is you're sellin' maps now." "Might be I could use one myself if it leads anywhere worth ridin'." Hardesty didn't look up. He quenched the red-hot spring in his bucket, steam hissing like a snake. "You'd best talk to the trader if you're buyin'," he said quietly. "I ain't buyin'," Stoddard said, stepping closer. "I'm askin'. You been showin' that paper to select company. Men say it's a Spanish drawin' of a silver road. You tellin' me that ain't so?" Hardesty finally met his eyes. Men say many things. That calm tone only stoked the fire in Stoddard. You think you're smarter than the rest of us? You and your fancy ironwork and your secrets? Ain't a man alive ever found silver in these mountains. You'd do better huntin' beaver than chassin' ghosts. Hardesty wiped his hands on a rag, folded it carefully, and said, Maybe. But I've found more worth followin' ghosts than followin' fools. For a moment the camp held its breath. The only sound was the distant laughter from the whiskey tent and the low murmur of the river. Then Stoddard spat into the dust, muttered a curse, and walked off, his companions trailing behind like dogs denied a fight. Later that night, as the fires burned low and the stars came sharp above the peaks, Hardesty sat alone outside his tent. He unfolded a small oilcloth bundle from his saddlebag. Inside lay a folded sheet of vellum, yellowed and brittle, its edges dark with age. By the flicker of the firelight, faint lines could be seen. Mountains, rivers, and a winding chain of crosses marked Mina de los Padres. He studied it in silence, one scarred hand tracing the path that led south from Taos into the high country of the San Juans. He knew the dangers that waited there, snow even in summer, Ute territory, and trails that vanished under stone slides. Yet something in the map called to him as strongly as the ring of his hammer on iron. It was not greed, not entirely. It was the promise that the land still held secrets big enough to humble any man. A wind came down off the peaks, stirring the ashes at his feet. He folded the map again and tucked it back into its cloth, sealing it with a strip of rawhide. In the darkness beyond the campfires, wolves began to howl. By morning the rumor had spread anew. Elias Hardesty was heading south after rendezvous, into the San Juan country, following a trail older than the fur trade itself. Some said he'd die there. Others that he'd come back rich as a prince. But among the men who'd seen the calm in his eyes that night, none would bet against him, and above the valley the mountains gleamed like silver under the rising sun. By the time the aspens turned yellow and the elk began to drift down from the high ridges, Elias Boone, Hardesty, and the 5 men who had chosen to follow him were already too far north and too late in the season. The first snows came early that year, riding the wind from the Wind River Range, and by the first week of November the country was locked in iron. The beaver ponds froze solid, even the creek ice cracked like musket fire in the night. They built their winter camp in a narrow basin where the cottonwoods stood black and the sun vanished behind the mountains before mid-afternoon. The sky hung low, gray and soundless, and each day grew colder than the one before. Hardesty's party was a ragged collection, Rafe Stoddard among them, still swaggering but quieter now. A French-Canadian named Leduc, who swore by Street Anne every time the wind rose, young Jeremiah Holt from Kentucky, barely 20, with hands cracked open from cold, and 2 crow hunters who had agreed to guide them partway toward the San Juans before the passes closed. By December, the snow lay 5 feet deep. The horses stood belly-high in drifts, ribs showing through their winter coats. The traps they set in the creeks came up empty, the bait frozen like stone. They boiled rawhide for soup and burned green wood that hissed and spat but gave little heat. It was during those weeks that the men began to understand what kind of mind Elias Hardesty carried behind his quiet eyes. When the last of their dried meat turned black with mold, Stoddard threw the bag into the fire in disgust. "We're starvin' while that damned map rots in your saddlebag," he said. "If there's silver ahead, we'll never see it." Hardesty didn't answer. He was staring at a half-buried mound where they'd cached the buffalo quarters from the hunt 6 weeks earlier. The hides had frozen hard as iron, but he noticed something. The meat inside the frozen layers of clay still smelled sweet when the wind shifted. He rose, fetched his hatchet, and began chopping at the mound. The others watched in silence as he worked the blade through the ice crust, revealing layers of packed earth, ash, and snow. Inside lay the buffalo flesh, red as the day it was cut. Leduc blinked in disbelief. "Mon Dieu, it is good still?" Hardesty nodded. "The clay keeps the air out, the ash dries it, snow does the rest." He cut a strip, held it to his nose, and smiled faintly. "It'll cook." That night, for the first time in weeks, they ate real meat. The fire crackled, and the steam rose from the pot in thick white curls. Even Stoddard, sullen as he was, ate until the grease ran down his beard. By morning, Hardesty had a plan. He led the men out to the frozen riverbank and showed them how to dig pits in the permafrost 3 feet deep, lined with snow and ash. Into these they packed what was left of their meat and hides, sealing each layer with clay he found along the cutbank. Over that, he built cairns of stone, marking each with a crossed twig driven upright, a signal only they would know. Leduc called it Hardesty's Folly. The others laughed too, until January came and every other cache of smoked meat had turned sour. Then they came quietly to dig at his mounds and found the flesh still red and sweet beneath the clay. "Crazy trick," Stoddard muttered one evening, gnawing on a roasted haunch. "But it's kept us from feedin' the wolves." Hardesty only smiled. A blacksmith learns early that what you can't burn, you preserve. Iron or meat, it's all the same principle. The weather grew worse. A gale tore through the basin, snapping trees like twigs and filling their shelters with snow. One of the crow hunters vanished into the storm while checking snares. They found his body 2 days later, frozen, upright like a post. The other, grief-stricken, left at dawn the next morning, heading east toward the Wind River country, leaving the white men to their fate. Through it all, Hardesty's routine never wavered. He mended traps, patched moccasins, and kept the fire small but constant. He boiled snow in a kettle lined with the black soot of the forge, catching the drips in a rawhide bucket. When Jeremiah's fingers froze so stiff he couldn't hold his rifle, Hardesty wrapped them in deerskin, smeared with bear grease and ash, muttering something about drawing the fire out. By February, they were ghosts of themselves, lean, hollow-eyed, and reeking of smoke. Yet they lived. One night, as the wind moaned through the canyon and the firelight danced on their faces, Leduc looked up from his pipe and said softly, "When the snow melts, you will go on, to find your silver?" Hardesty poked at the coals. "If the mountains let me." Stoddard snorted. "If they don't bury us. First." But there was less venom in his voice now. Hardesty lifted his eyes. "Every man dies. Most just choose small places to do it." No one answered. The wind carried sparks up into the dark, and for a long time the only sound was the hiss of wet logs on the fire. When the thaw finally came, it came suddenly, a warm rain that swept down from the south, loosening the drifts and sending sheets of meltwater roaring through the gullies. The men staggered out into the pale sunlight, thin as scarecrows, beards matted, boots rotted through, but they were alive. They dug open the last of Hardesty's clay caches, and the meat within was still fresh. Leduc crossed himself and said, "If ever I see a priest again, I will tell him I have seen a miracle." Hardesty shook his head. "No miracle. Just a little sense and a hard winter." Behind him, the peaks of the Wind River Range gleamed with snow like hammered silver, and to the south beyond the passes that were finally opening lay the San Juans, blue and inviting in the distance. The map waited in his pack, edges worn, ink fading, but the promise within it was sharp as ever. Elias Boone Hardesty turned his horse toward the rising sun. The others followed in silence, their breath steaming in the cold dawn. The man who would not freeze had kept them alive. Now he meant to find whether the mountain would yield its other secret, the one drawn in Spanish ink. When the ice at last broke from the rivers and the geese returned to the valleys, the men packed their camp and moved south. The thaw came late, and mean that year snowmelt turning the meadows to gray swamps, the horses stumbling belly-deep through mud, every mile won with a curse and a shove. Yet, after the long winter's confinement, even hardship felt like release. The world smelled of wet earth and pine sap, and the sun, though weak, was warm enough to sting their faces. Elias Boone Hardesty rode ahead, his blacksmith's hammer hanging from his belt beside his rifle. The Spanish map, folded into an oilcloth packet, lay in his coat pocket, worn smooth from his touch. Each evening by the fire he would spread it on his knee, tracing the faint brown ink that wound through the drawn mountains. Rio del Norte, Camino de los Padres, Mina Vieja. The words were nearly erased by time, yet something in their rhythm pulled at him as if the very syllables remembered silver. Rafe Stoddard followed with the others, still nursing his pride from the winter's humiliation. He no longer mocked Hardesty's crazy tricks. The memory of meat pulled red and sweet from the frozen clay had silenced him more effectively than any argument. But his eyes held a wary calculation, now a sense that, if the map proved real, he meant to claim his share. The trail south led them through broken country, ridges of red rock and sage, sudden gulches choked with runoff, and occasional bands of antelope flashing white across the plains. They passed the bones of old fire rings, stone circles half buried in grass, and once the remains of a crude wooden cross standing lopsided against the sky. Leduc crossed himself. "Spaniards," he murmured. Hardesty dismounted and studied the cross. The wood was blackened by age, the base sunk in frozen clay. Around it lay bits of slag and a few rusted nails shaped by square hammers. He turned one over in his hand and felt a kinship with the unknown smith who had forged it long before. "They were here," he said quietly. That night, as the campfire burned low, he spoke of what he had learned in Taos 2 years before. There were missions north of Santa Fe once farther than most men reckon. The friars sent men into the mountains to find silver for the crown. But the Ute rose against them. They say a whole train of mules vanished in a snow pass, loaded with ore. Only a handful came back. The rest were buried in stone. Jeremiah Holt, the youngest of the party, listened, wide-eyed. "You reckon that's what we're following, Elias? The lost Spanish mines?" Hardesty smiled faintly. "I reckon we'll find out." They pressed on into the foothills, where the land began to lift and the air grew thin and sharp. Snow still lingered in the shadowed ravines, but the valleys were greening fast. Mule deer grazed along the ridges, and streams rushed clear and cold over polished rock. The men's spirits rose with the altitude. They were lean, hard, and certain of their own endurance, now men who had beaten winter itself. One afternoon, while scouting ahead, Hardesty spotted a narrow canyon twisting into the mountain wall. Its entrance was marked by a cluster of stones piled unnaturally, as if placed there by design. He called the others, and together they dismounted and approached on foot. The canyon was narrow as a chimney, its walls streaked with red and yellow mineral veins. On the left-hand wall, half hidden by lichen, were carvings, crosses, arrows, and spirals chipped deep into the stone. Leduc ran his fingers over one of the symbols. "These are old, mon ami. Older than the fur trade, maybe older than the priests." Hardesty knelt beside the markings. In one place, the carving formed a line of crosses leading upward toward a cleft in the cliff. "Trail sign," he murmured. Someone wanted to be followed. They climbed, boots scraping on the loose shale, until they reached the cleft. Inside, a narrow ledge opened into a pocket of rock no bigger than a cabin. The air was cool and dry, and on the ground lay a heap of rotted timber bound with rusted iron hoops, the remains of ore barrels. A few blackened chunks of slag glittered faintly with metallic veins. Jeremiah whistled. "Silver, by God." Stoddard crouched, eyes bright. "Looks like you were right, Smith." He spat the old nickname with reluctant respect. "Ain't much left, but this means there's more higher up." Hardesty didn't answer. He picked up a piece of the slag and rubbed it between his fingers. The metal dust shimmered like frost. But beneath the thrill of discovery he felt something else, an unease, the same sense of trespass he'd felt years before when he'd found a half-buried crucifix in a burned mission south of Taos. They followed the canyon deeper the next day, tracing the stream that wound through it. The walls closed in until sunlight reached only in slivers. Here, more signs appeared, Spanish letters carved beside arrowheads pointing upward. But then, mingled among them, were different marks. Rough scratches of concentric circles, crude figures of men with spears, and hands outlined in red pigment. One of the crow hunters who had rejoined them at the rendezvous stopped short. "Bad place," he said. "Old spirits live in the stone. You'd call it the mouth of thunder." Stoddard snorted. "Spirits don't dig tunnels." "Maybe not," Hardesty said, "but men who do often end up ghosts themselves." That night a storm rolled down from the peaks. Lightning flashed across the canyon walls, throwing the carvings into ghostly relief. The men huddled under their tarps while the wind screamed through the narrow pass like a living thing. When morning came, one of the pack horses was gone, rope chewed clean through. The stream had turned to a brown torrent, and half their supplies were soaked. Yet even as misery pressed in again, Hardesty's resolve hardened. The markings on the stone were too deliberate, too human, to ignore. They climbed higher still, toward the snow line, where the air tasted of iron and the pines grew twisted by the wind. Late one afternoon, they rounded a shoulder of rock and came upon what looked like the mouth of a tunnel half collapsed, timbers rotted to spongy pulp, but unmistakably the work of men. Above it, carved deep into the rock face, was a single symbol, a cross set over a hammer. Hardesty felt the hair rise on his arms. "That's no priest's mark," he said softly. "That's a miner's." The men stood in silence, the wind sighing through the pines. After a long moment, Stoddard stepped forward, brushing snow from his beard. "Well, Smith," he said with a grin that showed more hunger than humor, "looks like your ghosts were diggin' after all." Hardesty looked past him into the black mouth of the tunnel, where the wind moaned like breath through a buried throat. The map in his pocket suddenly felt heavier than iron. He knew then that whatever lay ahead, silver, legend, or damnation, they were already too far gone to turn back. They entered the high country in June, when the snow still clung in white scars along the ridges, and the air smelled of cold stone and pine pitch. The peaks rose around them like cathedrals, their summits hidden in cloud. From the mouth of the old tunnel they'd found, a trickle of water ran down the slope, glittering in the morning light like liquid silver. Elias Boone. Hardesty stood in the chill wind, studying the dark opening. The timbers were rotted through, the beams splintered to pulp, yet he could see that the hole had once been driven deep into the rock. A real mine, not a legend, not just Spanish dreams and mountain talk. He and Rafe Stoddard went in first, torches in hand. The air smelled of mold and iron. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow rhythm. The tunnel ran 20 paces before ending in a collapse of rock. Among the debris lay fragments of pick handles, an iron crucifix, and a few dull lumps that glittered faintly when Hardesty lifted his torch close. "Silver ore," he said quietly. Stoddard grinned through the torch smoke. "Well, Smith, I'll be damned. You found your ghost vein." Hardesty didn't answer. He crouched, picking up one of the ore pieces. It was heavy, flecked with gray metal and black stone. But behind the wonder he felt the weight of something older centuries of men digging for riches and leaving their bones behind. They carried the fragments out into the light and laid them on a flat rock. Leduc rubbed one with the edge of his knife until the metal shone through. "It is true," he whispered. "The friars knew." Hardesty nodded slowly. "Aye, and something buried them here." That night they made camp near the mine mouth. The fire cast long shadows against the canyon wall. As the men ate their last strip of jerked meat, a movement on the slope caught their eyes, 3 riders watching from above, silhouettes against the pale sky. "Ute." The horses shifted nervously, ears pricked. Hardesty stood and raised his empty hands. "We mean no harm," he called. His voice echoed among the cliffs. The riders didn't answer. After a moment, they turned their mounts and vanished over the ridge. By dawn, they returned 7 of them this time, painted and armed with bows and lances. At their head rode an old man wrapped in a buffalo robe, his face lined like dry bark, eagle feathers tied in his gray hair. The trappers stood tense, rifles near to hand. The old man dismounted slowly and looked at Hardesty. When he spoke, his words were low but clear. "White men dig again where death sleeps, you wake bad spirits." Hardesty nodded respectfully. "We found what your fathers found," he said. "But we take only a little." The old man gestured toward the tunnel. "Padre's mine, blood there, many slaves. The mountain took them." He tapped his chest. "Not for men to open again." Stoddard stepped forward, scowling. "We're not asking the mountain's permission. If there's silver here, we'll take it." The Ute warriors shifted in their saddles. One raised his bow. Hardesty shot Stoddard a sharp look. "Hold your tongue," he said quietly. "You don't talk to ghosts or elders with threats." The old man studied Hardesty for a long moment, then said something in his own tongue to the others. One of the younger Ute dismounted and handed Hardesty a small object, a chunk of silver beaten flat and shaped into a crude cross. The metal was blackened at the edges, as though burned. The elder pointed to it. "This is what they died for. You keep it, remember." Then they rode away without another word. For a long time no one spoke. The wind hissed through the pines. Leduc crossed himself. "Mon Dieu, the old man was right. This place is cursed." Hardesty turned the cross in his palm. The metal was cold even in the sunlight. "Cursed or not," he said softly, "they left something behind worth understanding." The men worked the next day with picks and shovels, widening the entrance enough to crawl through the collapse. Inside, they found the remains of old supports, the smell of sulfur heavy in the air. Behind the rockfall was a chamber lined with glinting veins of ore. "By thunder," Stoddard breathed, "it's richer than the stories." The fever took hold then, the same that had ruined stronger men. They worked until their hands bled, hauling sacks of ore to the light, arguing over weight, over claims, over whose name would mark the find when they reached civilization again. By the third day, the mountain answered. A tremor rolled through the ground, faint at first, then stronger. Rocks tumbled from the ceiling. Leduc shouted for the men to get out. The torches flickered. Dust filled the air like smoke. Hardesty grabbed Stoddard by the collar, dragging him toward the entrance as a beam snapped above them with a sound like a gunshot. The ceiling came down in a roar of stone and darkness. When they crawled out into daylight coughing, half the tunnel was gone. Leduc's leg was crushed beneath a boulder, and one of the pack horses had bolted. The ground where they stood quivered, then stilled. Stoddard lay gasping, his face gray with dust. "The silver's gone," he whispered. "Buried again." Hardesty looked back at the sealed mouth of the mine, smoke rising from the collapse like breath from a dying beast. "Maybe that's how it's meant to stay," he said. They buried Leduc that night under a cairn of stones, his crucifix laid on top. Hardesty melted a piece of the recovered silver in his forge pan, hammering it into a thin plate and engraving Leduc's initials with the tip of his knife. "So the mountain knows his name," he murmured. The next morning he packed the remaining ore barely enough to fill a saddlebag and turned east toward the high pass. Stoddard limped beside him, eyes hollow, the fever of wealth burned out of him. As they climbed, the wind carried a low, mournful sound from the valley below, a sound like distant chanting. Hardesty paused, listening. "Padres or miners, it's all the same now," he said quietly. "They're still down there, keeping their faith." Stoddard spat, but there was no mockery left in him. Faith won't fill a man's belly. Hardesty looked back at the sun striking the snowfields, bright as polished metal. "No," he said, "but it might keep his soul from freezing." They rode on in silence, leaving the silver to sleep again beneath its mountain of stone. The passes were half clear when Elias Boone Hardesty and Rafe Stoddard turned back toward the canyon. Behind them, the graves of Leduc and the Crow Hunter were marked by cairns of stone, already whitening with the first new snow. They could have gone east to Fort Uncompahgre or north toward the Green, but Hardesty's mind refused to let go of the mountain's secret. There had been too much labor, too much death, for him to ride away from what he had touched. He wanted proof, something solid, to show that the old Spanish ink had not been a fool's dream. So they returned, against sense and against the warnings of the Ute elder. The storm that had shaken the mine had torn open a section of the cliffside. They found it 3 days later, a gash of raw earth and splintered stone, and there in the fractured wall gleamed a narrow streak of metal silver, bright as frost under the morning sun. It was so pure that Hardesty could see his reflection warped in its polished vein. Stoddard dropped to one knee and let out a laugh that echoed off the cliffs. "There it is, Elias. By God, there it is." Hardesty's hammer hand trembled slightly. "Aye," he said. "But it's thin as a knife edge and buried deep. We'd have to blast to get more than a handful." "Then we blast," Stoddard said. "We've powder enough for the mules and more." Hardesty frowned. "Powder's for survival, not fortune. We're short on meat, low on horses, and 3 days from decent water. This isn't the time." Stoddard's grin faltered into something darker. "You'd walk away? After all this?" "I'd live," Hardesty said. That's worth more than silver." But greed had already taken Stoddard's ears. He set to cutting the vein with his pick, sparks flying, his breath ragged. Hardesty worked beside him only long enough to keep the fool from killing himself, then pulled away, weary of argument. He went to gather pine boughs for the horses. The smell of pitch and dust filled the air. By afternoon, Stoddard's persistence paid or doomed them. He called out, voice wild, "It's hollow behind! There's a chamber!" Hardesty dropped the reins and hurried back. Stoddard was crouched by the cliff, torch in one hand, peering into a narrow opening where the rock had fallen away. The air that drifted out was cool and metallic, tinged with the faint reek of death. "Don't," Hardesty said sharply. "It's unstable." Stoddard ignored him. He crawled in, boots scraping stone. Hardesty cursed under his breath and followed. The space widened to a natural cavern, its walls laced with silver veins that caught the torchlight like spiderwebs of light. On the ground lay a collapsed timber cart, and, beside it, a skeleton still half wrapped in what had once been a friar's robe. Around its neck hung a rosary of tarnished silver beads. For a long time, neither man spoke. Finally, Stoddard whispered, "So this is what they were after." He knelt and began prying the beads from the corpse's neck. Hardesty grabbed his wrist. "Leave him." "Hell, I will. He don't need 'em where he's gone." The two men locked eyes, the torchlight flickering between them. Stoddard's pupils were pinpoints. His face gleamed with sweat. "Greed's taken better men than you," Hardesty said. "Don't let it finish what Winter started." Stoddard jerked free. "You talk like a preacher, but you ain't. You're scared of fortune same as you're scared of dying." Hardesty straightened slowly. "I'm scared of nothing," he said, "except fools who think lead and powder can buy sense." That was the breaking point. Stoddard's hand flashed to his belt, drawing his pistol. "Then maybe you won't need sense where you're going." The shot cracked like thunder, the sound swallowed by the cavern. Hardesty dove aside. The ball struck the wall above him, showering sparks. In the same heartbeat, the mountain groaned a deep, living sound, and part of the ceiling split. "Run!" Hardesty shouted. The second rumble was louder, the ground heaving beneath them. Dust poured down like smoke. Stoddard stumbled toward the entrance, but a falling slab struck his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Hardesty grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out through a cloud of grit and flying rock. They burst into daylight, just as the cavern behind them collapsed in a roar that sent boulders leaping like dice down the slope. When the dust cleared, the entrance was gone, buried under tons of stone. Stoddard lay gasping, blood running down his arm. "The silver!" he croaked. "Gone." Hardesty sank to his knees beside him, chest heaving. "No," he said quietly. "Just hidden again, like it was meant to be." For a long while they sat without speaking, watching the dust drift away into the blue distance. When at last Stoddard tried to rise, Hardesty helped him, binding the wound with a strip torn from his coat. "What now?" Stoddard asked, his voice hoarse. Hardesty looked toward the east, where the land rolled away in waves of pine and grass. "Now we live. That's all that's left worth doing." They gathered what supplies remained, loaded the horses, and began the long descent toward the plains. The weather turned warm and still, and at night the stars hung close enough to touch. Yet neither man slept easily. Stoddard muttered in his dreams, clawing at his bandaged arm as if the mountain still pressed upon him. One evening, as the sun sank red over the peaks, he turned to Hardesty and said in a low, uneven voice, "You were right about the ghosts. I heard 'em in the rock." They were singing. Hardesty didn't answer. He only looked back once toward the dark ridge where the mine lay, sealed again. The setting sun struck the cliffs, and for a moment the silver seams glimmered faintly like frost before it melts. Then the light died, and the mountain was nothing but shadow. By the time they reached the high plains, the map had crumbled to tatters in Hardesty's pocket, its ink blurred by sweat and rain. He burned what was left in the fire one night, watching the parchment curl and vanish in a breath of smoke. The silver was gone, the treasure lost, but something harder had been forged in its place, a truth as solid as iron. Some men chased the shine of fortune until it buried them. Others learned that the only thing worth keeping in the mountains was what you carried in your hands and what you could keep alive through the winter. By the time Elias Boone Hardesty and Rafe Stoddard reached the lower valleys, the air had turned sharp again, and the willows along the creeks were gold with the season's end. The mountains behind them loomed blue and cold, their snow peaks glowing like ghosts in the twilight. What little silver they carried fit in a tobacco pouch no bigger than a man's fist, a poor ransom for all they had lost. But the men themselves were alive, and in that land survival was wealth. They made for the Green River country, hoping to reach the old trapper trails before winter closed in. The journey was long and mean. The pack horses were thin and lame from the rock country, and half their powder had been lost in the storm that buried the mine. Game was scarce. Each day they woke to frost on their blankets, and each night the coyotes sang from the ridges, reminding them that the wilderness kept its own tally of the living and the dead. Stoddard grew quiet. The bullet wound in his arm had healed badly, stiff and twisted, and the fever it left behind seemed to have burned the swagger out of him. He rode hunched, eyes half closed, speaking only when necessary. Hardesty, for his part, said little as well. He had always been a man of few words. But now his silence carried something different, a thought hammering in the back of his mind, the way a forge hammer echoes long after it stops. By the time they crossed into the open basins of the Upper Green, the herds had begun their migration south. They took what they could, a cow elk here, a bison there, but the meat spoiled quick under the sudden cold. One night, after cutting away a spoiled haunch, Stoddard cursed softly and threw his knife into the fire. "All this killin', and it rots before we can chew it," he said. "If there's a hell for hunters, it's watchin' good meat go bad." Hardesty stared at the smoking carcass, the fat bubbling where it met the coals. "Maybe it doesn't have to," he said. "What?" He rose and walked to the river bank, kneeling where the clay lay thick and wet under the grass. He scooped a handful, squeezed it between his palms, and rolled it into a smooth ball. Then he stood, looked toward the dying fire, and the memory came back to him, the clay mounds he'd built the previous winter, the meat packed tight in ash and snow that had lasted half a year. "The trick that kept us alive once," he murmured. "Might do so again." Before dawn, he had them working. Together they built shallow pits near the frozen edge of the creek, lining them with snow and damp clay. They packed the fresh-cut meat inside, each layer sealed with ash and river silt, and covered the pits with stone and brush. It took 2 days to fill 4 caches. When they finished, Hardesty marked each with a cairn 3 stacked rocks and a cross carved into the top, pointing north. Stoddard shook his head. "You and your dirt magic," he said, but his voice held no mockery. "It's not magic," Hardesty said. "It's air that spoils meat. Take the air away, and time slows down." They moved on eastward, but every few days, when hunger closed in again, Hardesty returned to one of the caches and dug out what they needed. The meat came out red and cold, its smell clean as fresh blood. It was enough to see them through another week, then another. By late October, they were joined by a small band of trappers from Fort Hall, half-starved themselves after a bad run in the Wind River country. When Hardesty showed them his method, how to seal the meat in clay and ash, they stared in disbelief. "You're telling me this keeps fresh for months?" one asked. Hardesty shrugged. "Long as the ground stays cold and the clay stays tight. Learned it from watching the Blackfeet. They pack their buffalo this way for lean seasons." Word spread quick through the camp. Men who had laughed at him a year before were now digging their own clay pits by the dozen. They called it Hardesty's winter trick, though some muttered it was witchcraft or plain luck. But when the first snow fell heavy in November and their stores held sweet while the others turned foul, nobody laughed any more. It wasn't. Only meat the trick preserved. It preserved hope. In a season when even the hardiest trappers feared starvation, the camp at the Green River stayed fed, their fires burning bright while others fled to the forts. One evening, as Hardesty and Stoddard sat by the fire, the younger men drinking and singing nearby, Stoddard held a strip of roasted elk meat over the flames and said quietly, "You realize, Elias, this fool thing of yours has made you more famous than silver ever could." Hardesty chuckled. "Fame's a poor meal, Rafe. Maybe, but it lasts longer than most men's meat." For the first time in months, Hardesty laughed a low, honest sound. The wind carried it across the snow, where it mingled with the howls of distant wolves. That winter was one of the harshest the mountains had seen. The temperature dropped so low that steel traps cracked at the hinges and the rivers froze to their beds. Yet Hardesty's caches endured. When the men of the American Fur Company passed through in February, they found Hardesty's camp eating well, fat as summer. Charles Larpenteur later recorded the tale in his ledger. Among the trappers was a smith named Hardesty, who preserved his meat under earth and ash in the manner of the Indians. By this invention, his men endured 2 winters where others perished. It was much talked of at Fort Union that spring. When the thaw came again, Hardesty walked alone to the creek and uncovered the first of his pits. The meat within was still red, still whole after all those months. He smiled to himself, not with pride, but with quiet satisfaction. It was the same feeling he'd known when a forge fire took hold just right, when the metal glowed true under his hammer. He looked south toward the San Juan peaks, their crowns gleaming under the spring sun. Somewhere under all that stone lay the buried silver, the dream that had nearly killed them. But up here, in the open country of wind and clay, his crazy trick had given something better a way to last. He packed his tools, tightened his saddle cinch, and turned east, where the plains rolled away into the distance. Behind him, the cairns stood like small monuments to endurance, each one marking not treasure, but the stubborn, unglamorous art of survival. In the end, it was not silver that made Elias Boone Hardesty's name known among the mountain men, but the simple truth that a man who could keep his meat good through 2 winters could keep himself alive through anything. By the time Elias Boone Hardesty rode into Fort Union, spring had broken the back of winter. The snowmelt ran in silver veins down the slopes, the prairie grass shone wet and new, and the great river was a shifting mirror of sunlight and mud. Traders, voyageurs, and tribes alike had begun to gather again. Assiniboine lodges ringed the fort's outer walls, wagons groaned under the weight of furs, and the smell of wood smoke and tallow hung heavy in the thawing air. Hardesty came slowly through the gate, his horse ribs showing, the last of the trail's dust caked into his coat and beard. He was a sight to stir comment, a tall man, hollow-eyed, with a blacksmith's hammer at his belt and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth slung behind the saddle. His arrival caused the usual murmurs, men who had thought him dead, now whispering his name with something like awe. "By thunder," said an old trapper near the trading post. "That's Hardesty back from the San Juans. Didn't they say the Ute took his scalp?" Another laughed softly. "Reckon the Ute gave it back when they found out it was harder'n leather." Hardesty dismounted, nodded once to the trader Charles Larpenteur, and went straight to the smithy yard. His hammer still fit his hand like it had never left. Within an hour, the ring of iron on iron filled the fort, drawing a small crowd. Men watched him work silent, methodical, eyes fixed on the glowing metal as though he meant to strike memory itself into shape. That night, in the candlelight of the clerk's cabin, he laid the oilcloth bundle on the table. Inside were 2 things: a small pouch of raw silver nuggets, dulled by travel, and a square of parchment so worn the edges had frayed into lace. The Spanish map, the one they said had led men to ruin, looked ready to crumble at the touch. Larpenteur leaned close. "So it was real then? The mines?" Hardesty nodded. "Real enough to kill for, and to bury itself again when it was done." "Did you mark the place?" Hardesty's mouth tightened. "I marked graves, not fortune." He touched the torn vellum gently. "This belongs to the fire now. Some trails ought to end." But when he carried the parchment to the hearth and fed it to the flames, the strangest thing happened. The fire caught the edges, flared bright, and then died back, leaving the map smoldering but unconsumed. The ink lines glowed faintly in the ashes, like veins of light through stone. Larpenteur stared. "Saints preserve us!" Hardesty only smiled a little. "Paper's got more stubbornness than sense, like the men who chase it." He reached in with the poker, folded the half-burned scrap upon itself, and let it rest among the coals until it turned black. But even then, he thought he could still see faint markings beneath the char. Word of his return spread fast. Within days, traders and trappers came from other camps to hear the tale firsthand. They crowded the fort's courtyard, passing whiskey jugs and questions in equal measure. "Did you see the silver with your own eyes? Were there priest bones, like the stories say?" Was Stoddard with you? Hardesty answered each in his calm way, neither boasting nor hiding. Yes, the silver was real. Yes, there were bones too many. As for Rafe Stoddard, he had gone north that winter, broken in body and spirit, and Hardesty had not seen him since. Some said Stoddard froze in a March storm. Others swore they saw him weeks later, wandering along the Powder River with a half-crazy glint in his eye, still chasing ghosts of silver. When the crowd thinned, Hardesty sat alone on the porch of the blacksmith's shed, watching the sunset turn the river copper-red. His horse grazed near the gate, and in his lap lay one of the small silver nuggets, smooth now from being turned over and over in his hand. He thought of the men who had followed him, Leduc with his songs, the crow who'd laughed at the wind, young Jeremiah Holt whose last letter home still waited in Hardesty's pack. He thought of the old Ute chief and his warning, "The mountain keeps what it kills." Maybe that was true for more than mountains. That evening the fort's clerk came to him with a quill and ledger. "You ought to write it down," he said, "before memory goes cold." Hardesty shook his head. "Men will write their own stories. All I did was live mine." "But they'll twist it," the clerk said. "In a few years they'll be saying you found a river of silver, that you built a kingdom in the mountains." Hardesty smiled faintly. "Then let 'em. Truth don't stop a man from dreaming." He rose, took the last piece of silver, and tossed it into the fire. It hissed, flared, and vanished. "That's all the fortune I need," he said quietly. In the morning he was gone. Larpenteur found the smith's apron folded on the anvil, a small iron crucifix hammered from the San Juan silver resting on top. The map's ashes had been swept into a tin cup and sealed with wax. No note, no goodbye. Weeks later, a party of traders heading toward Fort Laramie swore they saw a lone rider traveling east across the plains, a tall man on a dun-colored horse, moving steady and unhurried, with the sun flashing off something metallic at his belt. Years passed, and the tale of the lost Spanish mines took root in the camps like a hardy weed. Each retelling grew brighter, wilder. Some said Hardesty found a second map hidden in the mountains. Others claimed he died rich in Santa Fe, or poor and content beside a blacksmith's forge in Independence. But among the older hands the truth was simpler, and they said it with respect. Elias Hardesty, the man who could keep meat good through 2 winters and never lost himself to silver. At Fort Union, Larpenteur kept the cup of ashes on his shelf for many years. When he opened it once, out of curiosity, he swore that faint brown lines still showed on the inner rim crosses, rivers and mountains, etched by heat and memory. The map, it seemed, would not burn. And so neither did the legend. The sun hung low over the plains, a pale coin drifting in a haze of dust and wind. Wagon wheels creaked, oxen grunted, and the long file of westering families inched across the grasslands like a pilgrimage of ghosts. 7 years had passed since anyone at Fort Union had last seen Elias Boone Hardesty. Yet among the wagoners, the trappers, and the traders his name still moved like a river under the talk steady, half-whispered, and impossible to dam. They called him many things, the man who wouldn't starve, the smith of the frozen beef, the ghost of the San Juans. Some said he'd gone south to Mexico, teaching soldiers how to temper swords that never rusted. Others claimed he'd been seen hammering wagon rims in street. Louis, gray now but still strong enough to drive a spike with one swing, and a few, mostly old mountain men with smoke in their beards, swore they'd glimpsed him out on the prairie again, alone, riding toward the setting sun, with an anvil lashed to his pack mule and a rifle across his knees. That last rumor turned out true. Hardesty had wandered first to the towns, where iron and coin held sway, then back to the open country, where a man's worth was measured by endurance, not gold. The cities had felt too crowded, too loud with schemes and sermons. He'd mended wagon tongues for settlers and horseshoes for soldiers, but at night he dreamed of rivers under snow and fires that burned slow in the high mountain dark. So he came west again, following no man's call, and by the fall of '42 he rode once more through the country he had nearly died in. The land had changed. The old rendezvous grounds were empty now, the fur trade dying, as beaver hats went out of fashion. The forts were fewer, the trails busier with emigrant wagons. Yet the wind still smelled of sage and snow, and the mountains still wore their crowns of ice. To Hardesty, it was enough. He rode with an easy seat, the hammer still at his belt, his beard streaked white but his eyes bright. In his saddlebags, wrapped in oilcloth, he carried a small book a ledger Larpenteur had sent him years before, asking him to record whatever truths the wilderness still remembers. The pages were mostly blank, though a few held sketches in a blacksmith's rough hand, a map of the Green River country, the pattern of his clay meat cache. The words, "To keep life is better than to find silver." One evening, as he camped beside a bend of the Platte, a small group of emigrants drew near a young couple and their 2 children, their wagon wheels split on the trail. The man hailed him nervously, for in those days a stranger alone in the plains could be outlaw or savior both. "Evenin', sir," the farmer said. "We could use a bit of iron luck. Wheels cracked, and I've no blacksmith's tools." Hardesty smiled. "You've found one anyhow." He set up his little forge with the ease of long habit built of stone, bellows worked by foot, the coals glowing orange against the dusk. He melted the rim's edge back together, tapping it true while the boy watched, eyes wide at the shower of sparks. "What's that tool for?" the boy asked, pointing to the hammer on Hardesty's belt. "This?" Hardesty said, holding it up. "It's for making things right again when the press-mit world breaks 'em." The boy grinned. "Pa says we're going to Oregon. You ever been?" Hardesty looked toward the west, where the sky deepened into violet. "Not yet," he said. "But I've been where maps stop matterin'." When the work was done, the farmer offered him payment a few silver coins, dull with wear. Hardesty shook his head. "Keep it. The road's long, and silver don't mend wheels near as well as kindness." They shared supper instead, salt pork, hard bread, and a tin of coffee black as tar. As they ate, the woman asked softly, "You've been out here alone a long while, haven't you?" He nodded, "Long enough to know that the land remembers more than we do. Every fire leaves smoke in the wind, every voice leaves an echo. Even the foolish ones. Are you looking for something?" she asked. Hardesty thought about that for a while, staring into the flames. "No," he said finally. "I think I found what I was meant to find years ago, and near lost it because I didn't know it was enough." When the family turned in for the night, Hardesty sat awake, feeding the fire small sticks, listening to the river murmur. He pulled the old Spanish map's ashes from his pack, a relic he'd kept sealed all these years, though he'd told himself otherwise. Inside, faint lines still ghosted the tin's lid, ridges, crosses, and the curve of a river. The map that wouldn't burn. He smiled at it at himself and scattered the ashes into the wind. They rose and twirled like gray snowflakes, vanishing into the endless dark. At dawn, he helped the family hitch their wagon and watched them roll westward until they were no more than dust on the horizon. Then he mounted his own horse and turned south toward the high country one last time. Some say he wintered again in the Green River Valley, teaching a handful of young trappers the secret of the clay pits. Some say he died there, sitting upright by his forge, with his hammer across his knees and a half-finished horseshoe still glowing in the coals. Others claim he vanished into the San Juans, chasing the same ghosts that had haunted him since 1834. But the story that endured came from a crow hunter who swore he saw him at sunrise, years later, near the mouth of the Yellowstone, a lone rider crossing the prairie with a mule train behind him. The hunter said the man paused, turned in the saddle, and raised his hammer once toward the sun, as if saluting the day itself. No one ever found his grave. Yet on some old trappers' trails, you can still see his cairns, 3 stones stacked and a cross carved on top, marking where a man once learned to turn hunger into invention and greed into wisdom. And when the winter wind comes down from the Rockies, carrying the smell of snow and forge smoke, the old-timers say that's Hardesty himself, still tending his fire in the high country, hammer ringing faint but steady against the heart of the mountain, reminding whoever's left to listen that in a land of ghosts and silver, the truest treasure is simply to endure.